This video is a brief overview of international political economy and the history of trade, discussing the major theories and perspectives of international political economy and how countries should relate each other in terms of trading and economy. Now, first of all, international political economy, IPE, assumes that states are interdependent in the global economy. Mutual dependence, this way of viewing the relationship between countries based on the level of sensibility and vulnerability that one country has to another or to others, how exposed they are to world markets, if you will. Three different perspectives on this. Liberalism, classical liberalism, think about free markets as a positive good, that progress happens through wealth and economic growth, that individual freedom is an inherent good, and that therefore the state should not inhibit the freedom of individuals to trade freely with each other across borders, to buy the goods that they feel are the best for them, or to sell the goods that people in other places, including other countries, might want to buy. So, therefore, a limited role for the state. Marxism argues that capitalism exploits workers, and therefore the global economy is unequal, and therefore there should be ways to control how capitalist countries behave in the global economy so that people in poorer countries are not unduly exploited. Nationalism views the economy as competitive. There is no win-win situation. If someone wins, someone else loses. States seek to survive, so the state should be strong to control the economy so that the country in question does not get exploited by others. So it's kind of a reversed Marxism. It's not so much the rich countries are exploiting poor countries far away. If we are in a rich country, it's our country might get tricked and used and fooled by another country, so therefore we have to control this. If we look then over timeline of trade, we can divide the history, modern history if you will, including pre-modern history, into several different eras. Starting with the 1500s to 1700s, the age of mercantilism, and this was also the age of colonialism very much, colonialism and empires. In this time, the state had a great deal of control on foreign trade in many, many cases. That was the era of absolute kings in many cases, France and other European countries, and as such, this was the era when Adam Smith emerged urging free trade and a minimal role for the state. So his writings then about the invisible hand of the market and so on was a way to challenge mercantilism. Then in the mid-1800s to 1930s, we can speak about early free trade. Now this went in waves, and sometimes it was more free trade and sometimes it was less. But one such example could be the time when Britain repealed the Corn Laws in 1846, which was a set of laws that regulated the trade in grains in Great Britain. And because Britain did so, stopped regulating the trade in grains, that opened up British agricultural trade, and other countries reciprocated, and therefore there was free trade in that for a while in Europe. But with the rise of the Great War, and between the wars, there was a rise of era of protectionism. When some states outperformed others, the countries that were outperformed started introducing protectionist measures. The idea was protect their own economies, but because so many did it at the same time, everybody encountered problems, and demand fell, and so on and so forth. It led to a time of increased economic conflicts, and one could speak about that as a way where the economic frictions between countries spilled over into politics and very possibly into war. Of course, 1930s with the Great Depression. Marxism argues that the economy failed because of the inherent contradictions in capitalism. The remedy then would be increased government regulations and stimulus spending and Keynesian economics. Classical liberalism argued that the economy failed because of government action, which turned a recession into a depression, specifically introducing tariffs in global trade, which turned what could have been a simple recession into a depression. So the remedy then would be deregulation and more Friedmanian or laissez-faire economics in various ways. After World War II, a lot of things changed. We can talk about genuinely systemic change on a worldwide basis. We have the emerging dominance of the United States in a bipolar world where the United States was on one side and the Soviet Union was on the other. We have a lot of colonies that struggle for independence and in a lot of cases achieve independence and sovereignty, some through armed struggle and some through negotiation. We have a set of new institutions to regulate the world economy, the Bretton Woods system. We have the rise of Keynesian economics that is adopted by a lot of governments across the world. And we have the rise of the welfare state, which is adopted by a lot of rich countries domestically in many cases. And is also kind of the start of globalization. So these international organizations, the Bretton Woods system, GATT, WTO, IMF, all of these is an emerging globalization. So even though there's still a lot of regulations on moving money between countries and on trade, there are these institutions that are starting to be set up. So in the 1970s, we see oil shocks. The economic orthodoxy of the day is challenged because suddenly the government cannot cope with the economic situation that is emerging, the economic crisis that is emerging, and so something has to be done. You have the price increase in 1973, the oil shocks that affect the entire economy, the OPEC countries that come together to control these oil prices, and thus a lot of debt crisis emerging because of this. So all of this challenges the previous economic orthodoxy of Keynesianism. And before we move on to the 1980s, just a look at the state tools for economic controls, and a lot of them had been used during this era, post-war era. So wage and price controls, the government can set a cap on how much a commodity can cost or how high salaries can get. This is uncommon in entrenched democracies today, but it did happen during the Keynesian era, the post-war era. So Nixon introduced wage and price controls in the mid-70s. There were controls on how high salaries could get during World War II as well. Currency regulations were quite common before the 1980s, so limiting the amount of currency someone was allowed to take across the border. That doesn't happen much today. Tariffs were also common, certainly in the 1930s, but also after the war. So that was a common tool for governments to use during that era. Subsidies as well, payments made by government to businesses to compensate them for inefficiencies and lack of competitiveness. That's the ostensible rationale. And then, of course, we can talk about non-tariff barriers, so imposing national content requirements on certain products. In Canada, there is the requirement that broadcasting includes Canadian content. You can have in NAFTA, there is some content requirements. So if a product should say made in the USA or made in Mexico, you have to look at how much national content is in a certain product and so on. Or you can apply quotas to imports. So only so much of a particular product is allowed to go over the border. That's not a tariff. That's a quota. That's something else. And then we come to the era of globalization, the 1980s and post-1980s, which is much more economic integration, interdependence of world economies. We see the European Economic Community transform into the European Union, increased mobility for capital. Now there are fewer barriers for moving currency across the national borders, increased information flows, of course, greatly facilitated by the emergence of the internet, increased migration as well. depending on what part of the world you're in. Now, it's still harder for labor to move than for capital, as we have seen recently with the discussion about the refugee crisis and still millions of people stuck in refugee camps across the world. So we're not in a situation of free movement at the moment. Now, we are in a world that has more free trade than was the case in the immediate post-war era. So in theory, free trade would then promote efficiency, prosperity, and peace, since interdependent states would avoid conflict. And that principle is the very foundation of the European Union. And with that, the rise of the global metropolis. If you go to any major city in the world today, you will find a lot of similar things. You'll find McDonald's and jeans and Coca-Cola and pop culture. That will be instantly recognizable wherever you are. So there are different perspectives on these developments on trade. In classical liberalism, increased free trade, a classical liberal would argue, has increased the average standard of living globally dramatically over the past 30 years. There's still much left to be done, but the classical liberal would argue that where there still is poverty, it's very much because there are still trade barriers that obstruct free trade and barriers to free movement. They would point to the fact that the poorest countries in the world often also are the countries with the most obstructions on trade. Marxism would argue that the neoliberal era has resulted in too much deregulation and with increased differences between rich and poor. So if we look at developments within countries over the past 30 years, economic inequalities have grown. And there is an ongoing debate on whether globally economic inequalities have grown. Classical liberals would argue that globally speaking, economic inequalities have gone down because there are so many more people living in middle-income countries now than in 1970. Marxists would point out that in each country, economic inequalities are growing, and this is a problem that should be acknowledged. And therefore, they argue that new regulations and institutions are needed. There was the Tobin tax was discussed as a global tax on transnational capital transactions, for instance. The economist Piketty argued along similar lines. The third perspective, nationalism, would argue that a globalized economy threatens the sovereignty of individual states, that international competition has led to a new need for protectionist measures to keep jobs from leaving the country. So the Buy American clause was one practical example of that, but we see it now with trade wars and discussions about Brexit, for instance. So that's a perspective in which the countries should not engage in multilateral institutions and should instead perceive trade as a situation where there can't be a win-win situation where both sides win. And that is then an encouragement to close the borders more to the rest of the world. So that's an overview of three major schools and their perspectives on world trade. And the international trading system have gone from a period of little regulation to more attempts to regulate. And the question then is, are we heading back to re-regulation of the economy in the way of the 1930s or post-war consensus? So this then contains the issue of protectionism versus free trade. And the conclusion then will depend greatly on what theory one relies on. Thank you.